All right, so welcome to the deep dive. We're all about like pulling out the really important stuff from sources, you send our way, and we know our learner, you're looking to get up to speed, fast, but like really thoroughly. And we want those aha moments, right? Like the real takeaways without getting totally overwhelmed with information.
Yeah, exactly. Avoiding that information overload. It's a common problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you flagged this book as something you really wanted to understand. And it's called The Modern Survival Manual, Surviving the Economic Collapse by Fernando Ferfal Aguirre.
That's right.
And I think what makes this book really unique is he's not just like theorizing,
Yeah.
He actually he lived through the 2001 economic collapse in Argentina, like directly experienced this thing.
It wasn't theoretical for him. It was real.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like today, our mission is to kind of like break down what he saw, right? Like what were his main takeaways and the advice he gives for like navigating a really serious socioeconomic crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this comes from his own experiences, right? It's not just
grounded in reality, right?
Yeah, grounded in what he actually went through.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting is that, Argentina is a Western capitalist country.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not like some far-off place that's totally different from, our experience. And it was a relatively, prosperous country.
They had been doing pretty well.
Yeah. So like his insights into how a society like that can completely like fall apart economically.
Yeah.
It really carries some weight.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's get into it. Let's start with the Argentine crisis itself in 2001. What were some of the big factors that led to this whole thing like imploding?
Okay, well, leading up to 2001, you had a bunch of really damaging things happening at the same time. So you've got the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. They kept giving Argentina these loans.
Right.
Even though it was pretty clear the government couldn't pay them back.
Like they weren't going to be able to make their payments.
Right, yeah. And on top of that, you had widespread corruption, officials racking up huge amounts of foreign debt. And probably the most unsustainable thing of all was this artificial peg they had. They pegged the Argentine peso to the U.S. dollar at a 1-to-1 ratio.
Like trying to force them to be equal.
Exactly. Trying to make these two things that had very different values trade as if they were the same. Yep. And eventually, reality has to kick in.
Right. Can't escape reality forever.
Right.
So when it did, what happened? Like what was the immediate impact when that, that bubble burst?
It was a complete and total mess.
Like fast.
Fast and dramatic. Aguirre describes like these violent protests breaking out, looting everywhere. The government, they declared martial law, and then they froze every single bank account.
All of them.
Yeah. That's the corralito. I mean, can you imagine? People could only take out 250 pesos a week.
Oh, my gosh.
That's like nothing. And get this. Argentina went through 4 presidents in 1 week. 4. Yeah. Total chaos. And of course, the peso got devalued. It went from that fake 1-to-1 all the way down to like 3 or 4 pesos to the dollar.
Wow. I mean, just from like reading his description, that sounds like just absolute pandemonium.
It was.
So what was that like for everyday people? Like, how did this impact their lives day to day?
So economically, it was devastating. Unemployment went through the roof, over 25%. Inflation was just out of control. Like, the value of your money was changing almost by the hour.
Yeah.
Aguirre says the average worker's income went from like $841 a month to $250.
That's a huge drop.
Oh, yeah. Like a massive decrease in what you could buy.
And so with like that kind of shock to the system, I imagine society kind of started breaking down pretty quickly, too.
Wow, absolutely. Crime went way up. And Aguirre talks about these zona liberata.
Zona liberata.
Yeah, these areas where the government had basically lost control. Total lawlessness. And he even had his own close call with the whole Carlito thing.
Oh, really?
He's trying to get his family's savings out right before they froze everything. Smart.
Yeah. But even then, the bank was like hesitant to give him even a small amount in U.S. dollars. And, in the end, all those dollar accounts were forced into pesos.
So they lost a ton of their savings.
Yeah, basically wiped out overnight. And, the thing is, our learner, this is how fast it can all happen. Financial systems can just seize up like that.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a slow decline. It was a sudden stop.
Like a light switch.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to at least think about scenarios where you can't access your own money. Like, what would you do?
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
And Aguirre says people started marking time as like before and after 1-to-1 or before and after the crisis.
Yeah.
So, like, this event just became like a dividing line in their history. And this is really what made him write the book, right? This experience.
Right.
So what was he seeing in all the survival advice out there that he felt was missing?
Well, he was really concerned about all the misinformation he saw, especially in the survivalist community.
What kind of misinformation? About preparing for economic collapse specifically. He was really critical of people relying on fictional scenarios or religious fanaticism or just like, baseless theories.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. His point was that most survival books weren't based on actually living through something like this, like a real socioeconomic collapse in a Western context. That's what was missing.
Mm-hmm. And he even had trouble getting this book published, right?
He did. Some publishers thought it was too aggressive.
Too real.
Yeah, too real. Or they thought there were already enough books out there that covered this stuff, but like you said, with a less realistic viewpoint.
Right.
But he wanted to tell it like it is, unfiltered, reality-based.
Okay, so having gone through this firsthand, what are some of the things Aguirre says are really important to prepare for? It's not just about stocking up on food, right?
Not at all. He puts a lot of emphasis on being mentally and physically prepared.
Right.
Like those are the foundations. On the mental side, he talks about developing mental fortitude.
What does that even mean?
Well, it's about building up the ability to deal with really tough situations without, completely losing it, without becoming a crybaby. He doesn't sugarcoat it.
Right. And what about this indoctrinated social behavior he talks about? Like, what's that and why is it a problem?
So he gives examples like how we're kind of conditioned to back down or be overly polite to strangers.
Mm-hmm.
And he says in a crisis that can make you vulnerable. So he suggests consciously changing those reactions.
Like how?
Like if someone pushes you, you push back.
Yeah.
Be more cautious around people you don't know. Be more comfortable saying no.
Yeah, like being assertive.
Exactly. It's about shifting from that passive mindset we're used to in society to a more proactive, like, I'm going to protect myself kind of mindset.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Especially things are really breaking down and you can't rely on, the usual social norms.
Right.
Okay, so what about physical readiness?
He says being in good shape is fundamental, like for your overall health, but also to be prepared. Like if you need to run or do some heavy lifting or carry a lot of weight, you have to be able to do it.
Makes sense.
He even had a LASIK surgery as part of his prep.
Really?
Yeah, so he wouldn't have to rely on glasses or contacts.
Wow.
Which could be a problem in a long-term crisis, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And he also says, take care of routine health stuff now, like vaccinations, dental work. Because you might not be able to get those things easily if things go south.
Right. So basically be as healthy as you can be before anything happens.
Exactly.
Okay. So resilient mind, capable body, that's like step one, according to Aguirre. Now let's talk about shelter. And he doesn't just mean like a roof over your head.
No. He sees shelter as encompassing security and storage too.
Okay. And he spends a lot of time on this whole city versus country debate.
Right.
What are his thoughts on that?
So, you hear that a lot in survivalist circles, right? The cities will burn. And he saw riots and looting in Argentina.
Right.
So he's not saying it can't happen, but he says don't just assume that rural areas are safer.
Interesting. Why not?
Because out in the country, if things collapse, there might not be any police.
Oh, yeah.
And you're more vulnerable to home invasions and stuff. He even heard some pretty disturbing stories about violent crimes happening to people who were isolated out in the countryside in Argentina.
That's scary.
Yeah, it's not what people typically think about when they imagine like a peaceful rural retreat.
Right. Everyone thinks you're safer in the country.
And he points out that historically, people moved to cities for security, for trade, for jobs. And he actually thinks that if there's a big economic collapse and unemployment goes way up, we might see even more people moving to cities.
To find work.
Exactly, to try to find opportunities. Now, he's not saying go live in some sprawling, chaotic metropolis.
Right.
But he thinks a good strategy might be a smaller town or a community that's near a medium-sized city.
Okay.
So you have access to potential jobs or education or, just social networks. And he also talks about how homeschooling could be really difficult in a serious crisis, especially if both parents have to work.
Yeah. That's a good point.
And then there's food. People think about growing food in rural areas, but he saw in Argentina that getting food to those rural areas became a big problem.
Because of distribution breakdown.
Exactly. Transportation just fell apart. So his main takeaway is to be near good medical care.
Like a hospital.
Yeah. Ideally within 15 minutes of a modern hospital. And he says having closer neighbors is also good because you can work together on security.
So it's a lot more nuanced than just city bad, country good.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about specific home security measures. What does Aguirre recommend?
Okay, so he's got a lot of recommendations, and they're really detailed. He comes from an architectural background,
Oh, okay.
so he knows what he's talking about. He starts with the idea that your house should be well designed for security from the beginning.
Like built with security in mind.
Right. And then he talks about reinforcing exterior doors and frames.
Yeah.
He wants you, our learner, to think like a burglar. Like, where are the weak points?
Yeah.
And he's big on motion detector lights, especially solar-powered ones, so they'll work even if the power goes out.
Right. Makes sense. And he mentions cameras and alarms, but what are some of the more unusual tech things he recommends?
So besides the typical stuff, he specifically recommends getting those motion-sensitive cameras that people use for, like, wildlife monitoring.
Yeah.
But put them outside your house so you can record anyone trying to break in. And he says, get a loud alarm system that sends alerts to your phone and has battery backup.
Okay.
Now, this one's a bit more involved, but he suggests putting burglar bars or security bars on your windows.
Really?
Yeah, especially bedroom windows, but make sure they have quick release mechanisms in case of fire.
That's smart. So you can get out.
Right. And he says get rid of anything flammable in the house.
Just in case.
Yeah, as a precaution. And he really likes security film for windows.
That's stuff that keeps them from shattering.
Exactly. So someone can't just smash the glass and reach in.
Yeah.
Those are becoming pretty popular now.
I've seen them, yeah.
Okay, so what else? Good quality locks on all exterior doors.
Yeah.
Deadbolts are key. And don't forget to secure the door between the garage and the house. People often overlook that.
Oh.
Don't leave any tools or anything lying around outside that someone could use to break in. And keep bushes and trees trimmed back so there's no place for someone to hide.
Okay.
And he suggests planting thorny bushes under windows.
Ouch.
Oh. Yeah. Natural deterrent. And simple things like heavy curtains to block the view into your house.
Right.
For valuables, he recommends having 2 safes.
2?
Yeah. A decoy safe that's like out in the open with some cash and unimportant documents in it.
You distract them?
Exactly. And then a real safe that's hidden and fireproof for your important stuff.
Oh.
And this one's kind of funny, but he says, try to make your house more secure than your neighbor's houses.
Why?
Because criminals are going to go for the easiest target, right?
Yeah, that's true.
If your house is a harder target, they'll probably just move on. And if you can, he suggests a fence or a wall around the property. And automatic lights that'll come on even if there's no power.
Okay, so that's like a lot of stuff.
It is. He's very thorough.
Very thorough.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's shift gears and talk about personal security when you're not at home.
Okay.
Because Aguirre says that becomes even more important after SHTF.
Oh, yeah. Because with more unemployment and potentially more crime, you have to be extra careful.
Right.
So he's big on security discipline at home.
Like, what does that mean?
Always keep your doors locked. Don't just open the door for anyone. Check who it is first. Use the peephole or the intercom. When you're airing out the house, make sure the windows are secure. You can even put things by the windows that'll make noise if someone tries to get in.
Oh, that's smart.
And be aware when you're coming and going from your house. Don't let your guard down. And if you go on vacation, make it look like someone's home.
Right. Like leave a light on?
Yeah, things like that. And always make sure the garage door is closed. Don't give out personal info on the phone. And be careful with strangers at the door.
Like, don't just open up for anyone.
Right. Especially if it's someone you don't recognize. Maybe only let your kids answer the door and don't engage in a long conversation.
Okay, so now let's talk about dogs, because he has a whole section on dogs and security.
Oh, yeah. He thinks dogs are super important. They can alert you to danger, and they're great companions.
Of course.
He warns about poisoning. You have to train your dog to only eat what you give them.
So they don't take food from strangers.
Right. He likes both small and large breeds. For small dogs, he recommends Jack Russell Terriers.
Those little guys.
Yeah. He says they're actually really smart and territorial, and they can even be good hunters.
I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah. And for larger breeds, he recommends German Shepherds. They're known for being trainable and stable. And Dogo Argentinos. Now, those are serious dogs.
Really like.
They're incredibly loyal and fearless, like they were bred to hunt big game.
Oh.
But he says they need an experienced owner. They're not for everyone. And he's a little wary of Rottweilers because he says sometimes they have temperament issues if they're not raised properly.
Oh.
But the interesting thing is he says don't train your dog to attack.
Really?
Yeah. He says just focus on basic obedience, and their natural instincts will kick in if they need to protect you.
Okay.
And he points out that just walking your dog around the neighborhood can deter criminals.
Because they're like a visible presence.
Exactly.
Okay. And then there's his gray man strategy for when you're out and about. Can you explain that?
So the gray man is all about not standing out, not attracting attention.
Blending in?
Yeah. So wear neutral colors, no logos or flashy brands. He likes multi-purpose gear like sunglasses that can also protect your eyes. Don't wear expensive jewelry. And wear good sturdy shoes. He even suggests steel-toed work shoes.
Really?
Yeah, because they're tough and they can protect your feet. And be aware of your surroundings. Be willing to do things that might seem weird to avoid danger. Like, if you feel uncomfortable, just turn around and walk away.
Yeah. Trust your gut.
Exactly. Have your keys ready when you're approaching your car or your house so you don't have to fumble around.
Makes sense.
Park close to the exit and face forward so you can get out quickly. And project confidence, like you're not an easy target.
Sure.
He calls it a sheepdog mentality.
Interesting.
And he makes a really important point about identifying threats. He says, bad guys don't always look like the stereotype.
Right.
Like professional criminals can look totally normal, well-dressed, blending right in.
So don't judge a book by its cover.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here with Aguirre's experiences and his recommendations.
We have.
So our learner, what are the big takeaways?
I think the main message is that proactive preparation is crucial. And it has to be multifaceted.
Okay.
Mental resilience, physical well-being, securing your home, personal awareness, all of it. Because what happened in Argentina shows that these kinds of crises can happen anywhere.
Even in developed countries.
Yeah, even in Western societies that seem stable. And the effects can be huge and long-lasting. And his approach is reality-based.
Not theoretical.
Right. It's a wake-up call compared to some of the other survival advice out there.
I mean, it's sobering, but I think it's also empowering in a way.
I agree.
Because it's about taking responsibility for yourself and not just assuming that the system will always be there to protect you.
Exactly. It's about moving from a state of dependence to a state of preparedness.
Right. And not out of fear, but out of a sense of responsibility.
Right.
Okay. So here's something for you, our learner, to think about. What's one concrete thing you can do today to be more prepared? Not out of panic, but just out of, considering the possibilities and wanting to be more resilient and self-reliant.
That's a great question.
Yeah. It's something to consider. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening. Ever feel like you're just bombarded with information online about safety and preparedness and all that? Trying to sift through it all, figure out what's actually important and what's just noise.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's so much out there. Sometimes I think half the stuff I see online is just plain impractical or even just flat out wrong.
Right. You end up more confused than when you started. And that's where we come in with the deep dive, trying to cut through all that, get to the good stuff. So this deep dive, it's for you, the learner. We know you're all about getting informed quickly, really diving deep into a subject without getting bogged down. And you send in this awesome source, The Modern Survival Manual by Fernando Ferfal, Aguirre.
Yeah, and what's really cool about this one is it's not just some theoretical stuff. I mean, this is based on real life experience.
Yeah.
Aguirre, he wrote this after living through a major economic crisis in Argentina.
Yeah.
In the heart of it, the federal capital, Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
Daily life, crime, everything changed drastically.
That's got to change your perspective, for sure. So today, we're on a mission. Pull out the most practical, right now stuff from this manual. The kind of insights you can actually use, no matter where you are or what you're facing.
For sure. We're not just summarizing the book. We want to dig into the core ideas, the reasoning behind the advice.
Totally. Okay, so let's get into it. One of the first things that jumped out at me was his take on situational awareness. And let me tell you, it is not your typical Hollywood stuff.
Yeah. He really challenges the whole idea of the obvious bad guy. The one. Shabby clothes, tattoos, the stereotypical thug.
Yeah, he completely throws that image out. He says professional criminals, the ones you really got to watch out for, they often look like regular folks, blend right in. He even says sometimes they're better dressed than their victims. I mean, that's kind of creepy when you think about it. He even mentions stories of people who got attacked and they remembered how surprisingly normal their attacker looked.
Right. Clean cut, well-dressed even, totally throws you off guard.
So the key here, it's not about what someone looks like. It's about their behavior, their actions. It's about reading the context, not the cover.
Exactly. You got to look beyond appearances. Observe behavior, what's going on around you. Do you see anyone who just seems out of place? Or someone who's like super nervous, even if they look totally normal otherwise? Are there people just hanging around with no clear reason to be there? Like imagine a bunch of guys in a residential area during the day, empty-handed. That's kind of sus, right?
Oh yeah, big time. He even mentions specifically robberies with motorcycles being a problem in Buenos Aires back in 2006. So it shows, how your local environment really shapes what kind of threats you got to be aware of. It's about knowing what's typical for your area, what sticks out, what's unusual. So let's move on to something super practical: home and vehicle security. And look, we're not talking about turning your place into Fort Knox,
No, not at all. It's more about those little everyday habits,
Yeah.
The ones that can really make a difference.
Absolutely. He really emphasizes how vulnerable you are just when you're coming and going, like stepping out of your house or getting in and out of your car. Those moments when you're distracted, focused on other things.
Right. You're not really paying full attention to your surroundings. That's when you're most at risk.
And the advice is so simple, but it makes so much sense. Keep your keys ready, like actually in your hand, not digging through your purse or your pockets when you're at the door. He even suggests attaching them to something, like a lanyard, so they're easy to grab.
Oh, and he mentions having the right key ready, too. Like, if it's your house key, have that one out specifically. Saves those precious seconds fumbling around.
Absolutely. It's all about minimizing the time you're standing there, exposed, Same idea with your vehicle, right? Have your keys out and ready as you walk across the parking lot, park close to the exit, face your car forward so you can make a quick getaway if you need to. Simple stuff, but it can make a big difference.
I like that. Be ready to move. Don't be a sitting duck.
And then he has this line, don't look like a sheep, but like a sheepdog. I love that. It's about how criminals are always watching, They're looking for easy targets.
Sizing people up, looking for weakness.
Exactly. And it's not necessarily about being physically intimidating or anything. It's about projecting this sense of awareness, like confidence. You're not someone to mess with.
Right. You're alert. You're in control. Not an easy mark.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about choosing and modifying your vehicle. And surprisingly, it's not about getting the most expensive or flashy car.
Not at all. In fact, he advises against it, especially in uncertain times. Why draw unnecessary attention to yourself? He actually suggests going for common, affordable models that are easy to find parts for. Practicality over flashiness.
Makes sense. And it's interesting, he uses the Renault 147 as an example. This car, it was stolen all the time, not because it was super valuable overall, but because the parts were in high demand on the black market.
Yeah.
It's crazy, right? You wouldn't think about that.
It's a good reminder,
Mm-hmm.
What makes a car a target isn't always obvious. There's a lot to consider. He even talks about the technical side of things, like the pros and cons of carburetors versus fuel injection.
Oh, yeah, that part was interesting.
Carburetors, older tech, but they could be easier to fix yourself. And they're more adaptable if you have to use alternative fuels, like compressed natural gas. Then there's diesel engines. He's a big fan of those.
For fuel efficiency, right?
Yeah, and because you can run them on things like biodiesel, even kerosene or heating oil in a pinch. But he does say you got to be careful with filtration and stuff. You don't want to ruin your engine in the long run.
Good to know. And this practical advice just keeps coming. He suggests thinking about a four-wheel drive if you might have to deal with debris in the road, roadblocks, that sort of thing, or even if you need to go off-road to escape something. But then he balances that by saying a medium or smaller vehicle is good for fuel economy and maneuverability in traffic.
Makes sense. You want to be able to navigate tight spaces, especially in a city.
Right. It all depends on your needs and where you live. Even the color of your car matters. He says to go for something that blends in, like dark gray, dark blue, or green. Less conspicuous.
You don't want to stand out, right? Be the one bright red car in a sea of gray.
Exactly. And the modifications he talks about aren't crazy either. Like anti-shatter film for your windows. That's a big one. It protects against thrown objects, smash and grabs, even offers a little bit of resistance against small caliber firearms. He also mentions tinted windows for privacy, but with the reminder to check local laws, of course.
Right, you don't want to get in trouble for that.
And then for a higher level of security, he mentions armored vehicles. You might even find used ones that belong to the government or diplomats or something. But he's realistic about it, too. He points out the cost of maintaining those things, especially those big military-style armored vehicles. It's not just about buying it, it's keeping it running, which can be expensive.
Not your everyday car, for sure.
Yeah. No, definitely not. Oh, and something simple but super effective, a steering wheel lock. He even tells a story about how one stopped his car from being stolen. It's that visual deterrent. Makes a thief think twice, maybe go for an easier target. And last thing on vehicles having a second, less noticeable car is a good backup plan, he says. Preferably one that runs on a different type of fuel, just in case. Okay, buckle up, because now we're getting into defensive driving. And according to this manual, driving in high crime areas is a whole different ballgame than what you learn in driver's ed.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He emphasizes that driving in those environments, you need a whole new mindset. It's about survival, not just following the rules of the road. You got to be prepared to react to unexpected threats.
Sounds intense. He talks about being an SHTF driver, like when things hit the fan, your priorities change. He even says that if someone tries to block you, you might have to accelerate, not brake. That's a far cry from being a polite, predictable driver.
Right. Like, forget yielding in right away. It's about getting yourself out of a dangerous situation.
He's really serious about it. Says that trying to be nice or following the rules could actually put you in more danger.
It's a different way of thinking, for sure. But it makes sense in that context.
He also stresses keeping a safe distance from the car in front of you, at least 10 yards. You need space to maneuver if something happens. And always keep your doors locked and your seatbelt fastened, no matter what. He even addresses that argument you hear sometimes about soldiers in war zones not wearing seatbelts. His point is, you're not in a war zone in the same way. You're more likely to be in a regular car accident, so that seatbelt is still crucial.
It's about weighing the risks, right? In that everyday driving situation, the seatbelt is still your best protection.
Totally. Now get this. He mentions a tactic, and it's pretty wild. If someone tries to open your passenger door while you're driving, he says you can try to catch their hand in the door as you accelerate. Now, he attributes this to some friend of a neighbor's uncle, so who knows where that came from. But he stresses it's purely for self-defense in a really extreme situation.
Wow. It really shows the kind of scenarios he's thinking about. Definitely not your average driving tips.
Not at all. And he strongly advises against stopping if something unexpected happens. Like, say someone throws something at your car, or you get a flat tire. Don't stop. Drive to a safer location first. It could be a trick to get you to pull over and make yourself vulnerable.
Right. You just never know. Better to be safe than sorry.
Absolutely. He also warns about things like purse snatching. People on motorcycles might smash your window to grab your bag, so keep valuables out of sight. And while he says not to speed excessively, you also need to be able to react quickly to hazards.
So it's like a balance, right? Not too slow, not too fast, but always aware.
Exactly. And his advice on approaching traffic lights in high crime areas, especially at night, is kind of scary. Even if you have a green light, be super cautious. People might not stop.
Yeah.
It really shows how the normal rules of the road can go out the window in those situations.
So much for trusting the green light, huh?
It makes you think, right? He even talks about potentially having to push obstacles or other vehicles out of your way. Like if something's blocking you and you absolutely have to get through. He says mid-size SUVs or smaller four-wheel drives with those big bumpers can be good for that. And he even mentions a technique for pushing on the rear wheel of a car to try and rotate it out of the way.
That's pretty hardcore. I'm starting to think I need a bigger car.
It's all about options, right? And as a last resort, if it's legal where you are, he says you might want to have a firearm handy. Just in case, to create a standoff. But he always emphasizes that reversing and getting out of the situation is the priority.
Right. Escape is always the goal. The firearm is a last resort, a way to buy yourself time and space.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, he also talks about the importance of not being predictable. Vary your routes, change up the times you travel. Don't let yourself become an easy target because someone knows your routine. He even mentions the 4 right turns trick.
Well,
Make 4 right turns in a row. If someone's still behind you after that, they're probably following you. Clever. I'm going to have to remember that one.
it's a classic. And even little things like wearing shatterproof glasses when you drive, for eye protection, you just never know. And last thing on driving, be wary of fake police checkpoints. He says to be cautious about stopping. Maybe try to verify if they're legit before engaging. Same with those seemingly innocent scenarios, like staged accidents or people asking for help. Drive to a safe spot first and call the police from there.
Right. It's sad, but you can't always trust people's intentions. You got to be on your guard.
It's a different way of thinking about driving, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so the manual also touches on some evasive driving techniques. These are like last resort moves when you absolutely can't escape any other way.
Right, like break glass in case of emergency kind of stuff. Exactly. He mentions the forward U-turn, the J-turn, which is like a reverse 180,
Yeah.
and S-driving to create space in traffic. He does say some of these, especially the J-turn, take practice to get right. He also mentions using your vehicle offensively against another car, but only in extreme situations. And he says if you're going to do that, make sure you have those reinforced bumpers.
Wow. That's getting into some serious stuff. Not for the faint of heart.
Definitely not. Okay, the learner. We've covered a ton from Fernando Aguirre's modern survival manual. Let's try to bring it all together. What are some of the biggest takeaways here?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that shift in perspective. We have to move away from stereotypes and really focus on behavior, context, the whole picture. And then there are those simple security habits, having your keys ready, being aware when you're entering and exiting your home or vehicle, and projecting that confidence like you're not an easy target.
Yeah, and that mindset for driving in risky areas is so crucial. Being proactive, decisive, putting your safety first, even if it means breaking some of those normal driving conventions. And knowing your vehicle. Making smart choices, even small modifications, can make a big difference.
All about empowerment. Taking control of your safety, even in a tough environment.
Absolutely. And remember, this information comes from someone who lived through a real crisis. So it's not just theory, it's lived experience. And no matter what your situation is, this knowledge can help you be more aware, more confident in your daily life.
And we all have this tendency to think it won't happen to me. It's called the normalcy bias. We assume things will stay the same. But the truth is, things can change in an instant. So here's something to think about: the learner. What's one small but important change you can make today to improve your personal safety, even if you don't think you need it right now? It can be something as simple as having your keys ready or being more aware of your surroundings.
It's all about taking action, moving from listening to actually doing something.
Because you just never know when that knowledge might come in handy.
So stay safe out there, and until next time, keep diving deep. Ever get that feeling like you're drowning in information, trying to figure out how to actually stay safe, but all you find is a million different opinions and theories?
Yeah, information overload. It's a real problem.
It is, and that's what we're tackling today. On the deep dive, we cut through all that noise and get to the core of things.
We find the signal.
Exactly. And today, that signal is personal safety and self-defense. We were talking about this before we started recording, and you mentioned wanting to really understand this stuff quickly but thoroughly, and I think we've got the perfect source material for that.
Oh, yeah. What is it?
Well, you sent me some excerpts from this book, The Modern Survival Manual, by Fernando Ferfal Aguirre. It's from 2009.
Oh, yeah. Ferfal doesn't mess around. He gets straight to the point.
He does. This isn't some feel-good self-help stuff. He talks about cultivating the right mindset, hand-to-hand combat techniques, self-defense specifically for women and kids, knives, how to use them, how to defend yourself against them, and then even unconventional weapons and firearms. It's a lot.
Sounds intense.
It is. But that's the whole point of this deep dive. We're going to break it all down, pull out the most important and actionable stuff, and try to highlight some of those really surprising details that can give you a whole new perspective on personal safety. No long lectures, just the good stuff.
So like the mental aspects, the skills, the tools.
You got it. Okay, let's jump right in. One of the things Ferfal emphasizes right from the start is the importance of having the right mindset. It's about more than just knowing some moves, right?
Right, absolutely. He says that your mental attitude is the foundation of self-defense, even more so than being physically strong or knowing a lot of techniques. And he tells this amazing story to illustrate this about a guy he calls one-leg guy. This was at a gun shop in Buenos Aires.
Oh, wow. What happened?
So this guy, he'd lost a leg, and he was the target of a carjacking. 3 guys, armed, tried to pull him out of his car.
I mean, you would think in that situation, most people would just give up the car.
You'd think so, right? But not this guy. He fought back like crazy. He even managed to kick one of the carjackers in the face with his good leg while they were trying to drag him out of the car.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah. They ended up shooting him because they were so furious that this guy with one leg was giving them so much trouble.
That's so powerful. It really shows that your mindset, that refusal to be a victim, can be more important than any physical limitation.
Exactly. Ferfal uses that story to show that the will to fight back, to overcome the attacker, that's what matters most. And then he contrasts this with another story, a very different one, about these young women in Belgrano, which is like a wealthy area in Buenos Aires.
Okay, what happened to them? Sounds like a completely different situation.
It was. So one of these women, She was opening the door to her apartment building for two of her friends when this guy just forced his way in. He said it was a robbery and he had a gun, but he didn't actually show one. So there are three of them.
Three women.
Yeah, against this one guy
Yeah.
in their own building. And he doesn't even have a visible weapon.
Unbelievable.
Right. And they do exactly what he says. He takes them up to the apartment, ties two of them up, locks them in the bathroom, and then rapes the woman who lives there.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And he's not even in a hurry. He takes his time, eats her pie, drinks her soda. Then when her boyfriend shows up, he makes him lie on the floor and rapes her again. Before he leaves, he makes her wash herself, steals their money, phones, even takes her skirt.
That's horrifying. What does Ferfal say about why they didn't resist?
Well, he blames it on a lack of that mental toughness. He contrasts their softer upbringing in a wealthy area with, people who grow up in tougher environments where they're more used to the threat of violence. He makes this comparison. He says, sheep get eaten by the wolves.
It's a harsh analogy, but it really drives home the point.
It does. And then he goes on to talk about the moral struggle some people have with, harming another person, even if they're attacking you. He's very straightforward. He says you have to get over that. By stopping these attackers, he argues that you might actually be saving innocent lives in the future. He even says that, if you end up killing them, it's probably more merciful than they deserve.
Wow. Okay, so that's the mental game. Now, moving on to actual skills and training, Ferfal talks a lot about martial arts. It sounds like he has some pretty strong opinions there, too.
Yeah, he calls out what he sees as a lot of BS in the martial arts world. Exaggerated claims, unrealistic expectations, people talking about these mystical techniques. He specifically mentions Shaolin, Kung Fu, ninjutsu, even some Krav Maga practitioners who claim their stuff is too deadly for competition.
He really doesn't pull any punches. So what kind of training does he actually recommend?
He's a big fan of the Gracie family and how they basically revolutionized fighting with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or BJJ. He talks about those early Vil Tudo fights, which were basically no-holds-barred matches where different styles went up against each other to see what really worked. He makes a point of saying that real-world testing, under pressure, that's what validates a fighting system.
So it's not about tradition or theory, it's about what actually works in a real fight.
Exactly.
And what about today? Where does he see things going in terms of serious hand-to-hand combat?
He definitely leans towards cross-training and mixed martial arts, MMA. Combining different disciplines. He says a good fighter needs striking skills, like from boxing or Muay Thai, which is also called Thai boxing, and grappling skills, mostly from BJJ.
He specifically mentions learning to box as a crucial first step. Why is that?
He believes it gives you quick hands and teaches you to throw effective punches. He even explains how a knockout works, that sudden acceleration of the head that makes the brain bounce around inside the skull.
Yeah, it's not about brute force. It's about technique and hitting the right spot.
Exactly. And he points to the jaw as being particularly vulnerable, especially the mandibular nerve. He says a well-placed punch there can knock someone out, even if it's not a super powerful punch. But he also makes it clear that street fighting is different from sport MMA. In a street fight, it's all about survival, not winning points.
Right. There are no rules.
No rules. He uses the example of a riot. If you're a boxer, you can stay mobile and on your feet. If you're a grappler and you take someone down, you're suddenly vulnerable to everyone else. So he sees Muay Thai and BJJ as great additions, rounding out your skills.
Giving you more options, both for striking and grappling.
Yeah. And his biggest piece of advice, keep your technique simple. Focus on strikes that you could actually apply under pressure. And spar, spar, spar. He's a big believer in full contact sparring.
Making the training as realistic as possible.
Absolutely. Okay, so that brings us to those basic principles of hand-to-hand fighting that he talks about.
Right. What are some of the main takeaways there?
So first, he says you got to react violently, but with control. Street fights are fast and explosive, so you need to be aggressive but stay focused. Second, always keep your guard up. It's instinctive. Even babies do it, and it protects you from getting hit or grabbed. Third, he says you have to have a plan. Practice those basic combinations on a heavy bag and during sparring, because your attacker probably has some kind of plan too, even if it's not a very good one.
Don't just react randomly, go in with something in mind.
Right. And fourth, expect the attack. Most of the time, nothing will happen, but if you're mentally prepared, you'll have that critical edge.
Right.
Okay, now in terms of specific moves, he really emphasizes simplicity and effectiveness.
So like what?
Jabs, crosses, hooks, uppercuts, elbows, knees, low kicks. But he advises against high kicks. Too easy to lose your balance.
Yeah, makes sense.
And he says, don't just stop after one strike.
Yeah.
Keep attacking. Like firing a gun. You don't just fire one shot and then stop.
Continuous pressure.
Continuous pressure. And again, sparring is key. He says if a martial arts system doesn't include realistic sparring, run away from it.
So wear your mouse guard and gloves and get in there.
Yep. And he also talks about building endurance and upper body strength. Arms, forearms, hands, neck, shoulders, and being tough enough to take a few punches.
Which, of course, you learn by sparring.
Exactly.
Now, what about grappling? What does he say about close quarters fighting, like on the ground?
He's all about the neck. He describes this move, the rear naked choke, in detail. It's basically cutting off the blood supply to the brain. He says it takes about 10 seconds to knock someone unconscious.
10 seconds, that's fast.
It is. He even tells this story about using it on his sister-in-law's boyfriend. But he also warns about using too much force. You could accidentally break their neck.
Yeah, serious stuff.
Serious stuff. And besides the choke, he mentions arm bars and wrist locks as effective ways to control someone on the ground.
Okay, so that covers the basics of hand-to-hand combat. Now, Ferfal also spends a lot of time talking about self-defense for women and children, recognizing that they're often more vulnerable targets.
Yeah, he points out that criminals usually go after women first, then older people, children, and then men who look weaker. And because women are often smaller than male attackers, he says their strategy has to be different. It's all about speed, surprise, and using weapons.
So not trying to overpower them, but using their agility and any tools they have to their advantage.
Right. And he really emphasizes finding instructors who specialize in self-defense for women. And this is important, sparring with men. He uses the example of Tigresa Cuna, this female boxing world champion. She credits part of her success to sparring regularly with male boxers.
So training against bigger, stronger opponents.
Yeah, to get used to that kind of pressure and learn to overcome it.
What specific advice and tools does he recommend for women to carry?
He's a big advocate for pepper spray and folding knives. And he really stresses situational awareness. Being aware of your surroundings, who's around you, what's going on. And he gives some very specific advice on avoiding rape, don't walk alone, don't let your guard down, react immediately if you feel threatened, scream, run.
Be loud, attract attention.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He also says to carry a whistle or one of those personal alarms that also have a flashlight, avoid walking at night, and always be aware of your surroundings.
Good advice. And what about for young kids? Their approach would obviously be different.
Yeah, for little kids, it's different. He says they should scream loudly, yell something like, "This is not my dad," or "This is not my mom," and fight back, kick, punch, especially aim for the groin, run away as soon as they can. He says that initial reaction, that can really surprise the attacker.
Yeah, they don't expect that kind of resistance from a kid.
Right. And he says it's okay to make a lot of noise. Don't be shy about it.
Yeah.
Personal alarms can be good, too, if the kid is responsible enough to use one.
Makes sense. Okay, now let's talk about something else that Ferfal seems really passionate about. Carrying a knife for self-defense. It sounds like he sees it as almost essential.
Yeah, he starts by talking about how people are instinctively afraid of being cut. And he emphasizes just how dangerous knives are. Even something like a screwdriver can be deadly. He argues against simple weapon bans because, people can find ways to make weapons out of almost anything. And he points out that knives are easier to get than guns, even in countries with strict gun laws.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
He even says any knife is better than no knife. And he gives this example of women in Recoleta, a neighborhood in Buenos Aires, carrying serrated steak knives for protection.
Wow.
Yeah. And he says if it's legal to carry a knife, you should do it every day. He doesn't see it as criminal. He sees it as smart. He recommends having a separate fighting knife kept razor sharp, just for self-defense, and then a regular utility knife for everyday stuff.
Like a Swiss Army knife.
Exactly. And he says practice with a knife that's similar to your fighting knife. Get used to how it feels.
Okay, so let's say you've decided to carry a knife. How do you actually choose the right one?
He says stick with reputable brands. Companies that use good steel, make knives that hold an edge and can take some abuse. He mentions Cold Steel, Kabar, Spyderco, Gerber, Benchmade. Good quality, but not ridiculously expensive.
And what about the shape of the blade?
He recommends a blade that can both stab and slash. So that rules out some of those curved blades that are mostly for slashing. He likes blades with a belly, that slight curve that gives you more power when you slash, like a kukri knife.
I've seen those, yeah.
And he prefers a serrated edge for fighting. He says it catches better when you slash, compared to a smooth edge. He also talks about fixed blade knives.
The ones that don't fold.
Right. Harder to conceal, but more reach, and they can be more intimidating. He likes tanto tips. Those are really good at penetrating and making wounds that bleed a lot. He even suggested that in some situations, a shortened machete can be a really effective weapon.
Wow. But the main point is quality matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially the lock on a folding knife. Think about it. You end up in a fight on the ground. You don't want your knife failing on you.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. Okay, so you've got your knife. Now, how do you actually use it if you have to defend yourself? Ferfal goes into some pretty intense stuff here.
Yeah, he's very clear about how brutal knife fighting is. Lots of blood. And he debunks that movie myth of the quick, clean kill. He says unless you hit the brain or spine, the person's probably going to keep fighting and screaming for a while. In most knife fights, it's blood loss that ends things.
Oh, it makes sense.
And he addresses that, saying, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. He actually argues that at very close range, a knife can be more effective than a gun.
Really? Why is that?
Well, it won't jam, you don't run out of ammo, and it's really hard to disarm someone who knows what they're doing with a knife. He mentions the Tueler drill. Have you heard of that?
I think so.
It basically shows that an attacker who's within about 21 feet of you can reach you with a weapon before you can draw and fire a gun. So at that range, a knife can be a bigger threat than a holstered gun.
God, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah. And he mentions a couple of resources for learning more about knife fighting techniques. There's this book, Esgrima Criolla, which is about Creole fencing, the fighting style of the Argentinian gauchos.
Like cowboys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then another book, Put 'em Down, Take 'em Out. It's all about knife fighting techniques from Folsom Prison. He says it was interesting to see how these sources, one from these traditional cowboys and the other from prison inmates, actually had a lot of the same principles.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of actual techniques, he corrects this common mistake that you see in movies, holding the knife with the blade pointing down.
Right, like a downward stab.
Yeah, he says hold it with the blade up. He even says, you plan to have a corpse hanging on that blade.
Wow, that's grim.
It is. And he says the best stance is similar to a boxer's stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, slight forward lean, knees bent, balance, chin down, torso forward, hands up in a guard position. And he stresses footwork, practicing with a partner who's actually trying to resist you. He says use rubber knives or chalked knives so you can get a feel for the real thing without getting hurt. And keep it simple. Stabbing, slashing, disarming. Don't try fancy stuff.
The basics done well.
Exactly. And for smaller knives, like folders, he says keep it hidden as long as you can. Use your other hand to jab and distract, then attack with quick slashes and stabs.
So like a 1-2 punch, but with a knife.
Exactly. Jab with one hand, then go for the gut with a knife.
Yeah.
He also mentions this prison technique called the stitching machine, which is basically a bunch of rapid stabs, really effective with certain types of knives. And he contrasts this with the gaucho technique of dropping the guts, which is this horizontal slash across the abdomen meant to disembowel the opponent. He also talks about the stick and rip technique, which is stabbing deep and then pulling the blade along the edge to make a bigger wound. And he mentions how gauchos used to slash each other's upper body and face in these duels, but he makes it clear that the abdomen is the place to go for a lethal attack.
Yeah, that's where the vital organs are.
Right. And he moves on to talking about larger blades.
Okay, what's he say about those?
He defines them as anything 12 inches or longer, and he again mentions those shortened machetes as being effective. He describes this move, the hachazo, which is this overhead chop to the head with a big blade. Brutal. And slashes with longer blades are obviously really effective too, and you can get deeper stabs because of the weight of the blade.
So where should you aim for? What are the vital spots?
He covers all the major ones. The abdomen, of course, because it's not protected by bones. The liver, the kidneys. He says a kidney shot is incredibly painful. The chest is tougher because of the ribs, so you need a longer blade to get through. The neck, especially the carotid artery, major veins and arteries in the arms and legs, tendons like behind the knee, the sides of the neck, under the arm, the inner elbow, the wrists.
So many vulnerable spots.
Yeah. And the face, especially the eyes, but even just getting slashed in the face can have a huge psychological impact. And the most important thing he says is attack fast and keep attacking. There's no quick and silent death in a knife fight unless you somehow manage to stab the brain, which is almost impossible.
So it's all about overwhelming them with aggression.
Exactly. Now, what about that really scary scenario? You've got a gun and the other person has a knife.
That sounds terrifying.
It is. He says if you end up grappling with someone who has a knife, your free hand should immediately go to controlling the gun.
Makes sense.
And he says attack the face and neck with your knife, distract them, then try to slash the inside of their wrist, sever the tendons. He even explains how to jam a semi-automatic pistol by grabbing the frame and the slide, and how to grab the cylinder and hammer of a revolver.
To stop them from firing.
Yeah. Now, he also has this section on gaucho knife fighting tricks.
Those gauchos sound like they were pretty tough.
They were. So some of these tricks include using their ponchos, those traditional cloaks, to slap at the opponent's eyes, blind them momentarily, or try to entangle the knife. They would also drop their guard and kick dirt in the opponent's eyes. And this guy, Morera, he was known for making these quick forehead slashes to blind the opponent with their own blood.
That's hardcore.
It is.
Yeah.
Another trick was, if you stab someone, use your knee to push them away so you can free your knife.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And they practice throwing knives too, especially the larger ones, the falcones. And he even talks about techniques for fighting animals,
Yeah.
like wrapping your poncho around your arm as a fight target while you stab them with your other hand.
Wow. Okay, now for the really scary stuff. Unarmed defense against a knife attack.
This is the worst case scenario. He stresses that creating distance is key. Never give up. Use anything you can find, chairs, furniture, cars, trees, as barriers. Throw things to distract the attacker, look for escape routes. He says fighting should only be a last resort if you absolutely can't get away.
But if you have to fight, what do you do?
He says expect to get cut. Use kicks, frontal kicks to the stomach, low sweeps. Keep them low so you don't lose your balance. Good shoes can help, like steel-toe boots or leather shoes, and wear long pants. He also talks about using your clothing as a shield, like wrapping a jacket or shirt around your arm.
To block the knife.
Yeah. And the gauchos would do this thing where they'd use a dangling part of their poncho to slap the attacker's face or try to tangle the knife. He compares it to how bullfighters use their capes.
Interesting analogy.
Yeah. And he says, practice disarming, but with a partner who's using a rubber knife. Get used to the movements. And there's this other gaucho trick, stepping on the trailing part of their poncho to trip the attacker.
Oh, clever.
Yeah, and he describes this disarming technique where you grab the attacker's wrist with both hands, pull to unbalance them, twist their hand outward, then pivot your body so their arm is trapped under your armpit, and then lock their elbow and shoulder. He says you might even dislocate their elbow.
That's painful.
It is. But he emphasizes speed and strength and practice against someone who's not cooperating. And once you disarm them, attack immediately. Don't give them a chance to recover. Use anything you can as a distraction. Throw your keys, your wallet, whatever. And he actually says that disarming someone with a gun might be easier than disarming someone with a knife.
Really?
Yeah, if you can grab the gun, you might be able to control it enough to limit them to one shot. And he really stresses the importance of force-on-force training. That's basically realistic scenario-based training where you really put under pressure.
Sounds intense.
It is. Okay, now he also talks about using unconventional weapons. Basically everyday objects that you can use to defend yourself. He mentions a chair. You can use it to stab with the backrest or try to catch the blade in the seat padding. Gives you more reach than a knife, but it's slower.
Yeah, I can see that.
Bottles can be good too, especially heavy ones. And if you break a glass bottle the right way, by hitting the upper part at an angle, you can get a sharp, jagged edge.
Makeshift weapon.
Yeah. A baseball bat or a steel pipe, those are good for striking, but you have to be careful the attacker might try to grab them. He says aim for the head. And then there are smaller things, like pens, pencils, scissors. You can use those for stabbing, hold them tight, thumb on the end. An umbrella can be used like a stick, especially a long, sturdy one. You might even be able to tangle a knife in it. And then even smaller things, like nail clippers, small files. Hold them in your fist for extra force. Keys can be used as a makeshift knuckle duster, or you can use a long key for stabbing. He also mentions those keychain folding knives.
Those are pretty handy.
Yeah. He talks about brass knuckles too, so they can do a lot of damage, but they're illegal in a lot of places, and you can break your own fingers if you don't use them right.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And he's not convinced they're more effective than a knife against multiple attackers. And then he talks about using rope or a necktie. If you stretch it tight, you can try to control a knife or a fist, or make a loop to try to catch the head, especially from behind. He even talks about using it for choking, like a makeshift high head clutch. But he warns about practicing this stuff. They can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, now for the last big topic, and this is one that Ferfal is clearly very passionate about, firearms.
Yeah, he goes all in on this one. He acknowledges that guns are controversial, because of how they're portrayed in the media, but he's very clear. He sees them as absolutely essential for self-defense. He says the main purpose of a gun is to kill.
To protect yourself, your family.
Exactly. And he says you have to be willing to kill if your life is in danger. He cites NRA statistics that say a lot of the time just showing a gun is enough to scare off an attacker.
That makes sense.
He really criticizes countries where people can't own guns, and he basically calls any American who doesn't own a gun, if it's legal where they live, a fool. He talks about his own experiences that have convinced him of how important it is to be armed, and he's proud of the fact that he's never been a victim because he's prepared.
He seems very confident in his stance.
He is. He doesn't romanticize guns. He sees them as a tool that you hopefully never have to use lethally. But he says you have to think about those moral questions beforehand, about taking a life. And he warns about the legal and financial consequences of shooting someone. He also talks about that whole idea of, free people owning guns to protect themselves from tyranny. And he tells this really tragic story about a woman named Elsa Maria Escobar in Núñez. She was raped and murdered by a neighbor who was a known sex offender. And Ferfal believes that if she had a gun, she might still be alive.
That's a powerful argument.
It is. Okay, now he also gives this quick overview of firearms and basic safety for people who might not know much about them.
Yeah, that's important.
So he explains how guns work. The gunpowder explodes, creates gas, propels the bullet. He talks about black powder versus smokeless powder, and then focuses on modern cartridges, the bullet, the powder, and the primer. The firing pin hits the primer, ignites the powder, and then he describes the different types of handguns.
Automatics and revolvers.
Yeah. Automatics use a magazine. The bullet comes from a magazine, and they have this slide action. He explains the difference between semi-automatic, where you fire one shot per trigger pull, and fully automatic, which just keeps firing.
Machine guns.
Right. And then there are revolvers, which have a rotating cylinder that holds the bullets. And within semi-automatic pistols, there are different action types. Single action, where you have to cock the hammer before the first shot. Double action, single action, where the first shot has a longer, heavier trigger pull, but then the subsequent shots are single action. Double action only, where every trigger pull is like that first heavy one. And then striker-fired pistols, like Glocks, which are kind of a hybrid.
So many variations.
Yeah, and then he talks about basic gun safety rules.
Like always point the gun in a safe direction.
Right. And keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Treat every gun as if it's loaded. But then he gets really serious and says, here are the rules for people who carry a loaded gun for self-defense.
Okay, what are those?
First, and he really emphasizes this, guns are loaded. Always. He tells this story about how he thought a gun was unloaded and it went off and damaged his property. And he mentions a similar story about Bill Jordan, who was this famous shooter. Same thing happened to him.
Wow. So never assume a gun is unloaded.
Never. And the second rule is be sure of your target. He tells this story about how he almost shot his own mother in his house. He heard a noise, thought it was an intruder, almost fired. And he stresses that most of the time, a noise in your house is not a threat.
It's your cat knocking something over.
Exactly. Okay, now he also talks about this thing called the killer instinct.
What's that?
He describes it as this primal drive to survive, this bloodthirsty instinct that can take over when your life is in danger. It overrides fear and pain. He says it's not about being a soldier or finding some beauty in combat. It's about pure survival. And he acknowledges that fear is natural. It can even make you more aware. But the problem is when fear paralyzes you.
Freezing up.
Yeah. He says you have to train yourself to react aggressively, decisively when you sense danger. He tells this story about how he was with his wife and something happened suddenly and he just instinctively shoved her out of the way. He didn't even think about it. It was just pure reflex. And he says you have to develop that kind of response.
So don't hesitate. Act.
Right. Okay, and finally, the question that everyone asks, what gun should I get?
He probably gets that a lot.
He does. And his answer is simple. Buy a Glock.
Just like that.
Yep. He says he knows and respects a lot of other handgun designs, 1911 SIGs, high powers, Berettas, CZs, revolvers. But he's convinced that Glocks are the best for self-defense.
Why is that?
He says they're reliable, durable, accurate, they hold a lot of rounds, they're light, simple to use, corrosion resistant, and parts are easy to find. He even says he had a Norinco 19.
All right, welcome to the deep dive where we take a look at the stuff you're reading and help you pull out the really important bits.
So you can, get a good understanding of it without having to wade through all the details.
Exactly. Yeah. And for this deep dive, you sent us something quite interesting. It's excerpts from Fernando Ferfal Aguirre's book, The Modern Survival Manual, 2009 edition.
Right. This one's a little different. We're talking personal security, preparedness. This guy Aguirre, he went through some serious stuff during the economic collapse in Argentina. like real deal societal breakdown stuff.
Yeah, not theoretical, like armchair prepper stuff. He was in the thick of it. So what we're going to do is we'll explore some of the core advice he gives.
Yeah, and specifically, I think for you, the learner, the interesting stuff is going to be his take on situational awareness, like really understanding your surroundings.
Right, and then his thoughts on carrying a firearm if you own one. I mean, he's pretty adamant about that.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't mince words. And then, what to do if, God forbid, you actually find yourself in a confrontation. What are the tactics? What are the things to keep in mind?
And of course, being prepared isn't just about knowing how to use a gun. There's a whole lot more to it, and we'll dig into those essential steps he outlines as well.
Absolutely. Practical stuff, we're not going to get into all the doom and gloom scenarios, but we are going to give you some real-world takeaways.
Okay, so Aguirre kicks things off by talking about something he believes is way more important than any tool or weapon you could have, and that's situational awareness, being aware of what's going on around you all the time.
It's almost like a superpower, right? He's not talking about being some kind of action hero. He's all about avoiding danger in the first place.
Yeah, his philosophy is basically if you have to use your gun, you already messed up.
Exactly. And he has this great line. He says, what you learn in shooting school is what you end up using when you failed at situational awareness.
Oof. That's a real gut punch.
It is. It makes you think, all that training, it's your plan B. Your plan A is to not need it in the first place.
So how do we actually develop this awareness? What does he suggest we do?
Well, he lays out some really practical things. It's about making a conscious effort to notice what's happening around you. Not like being paranoid, but just, paying attention.
Like always knowing who's walking behind you, who's in front of you.
Yeah. And is there anything off about how they're acting? Like if you see a group of people, are they just hanging out, or is there something a little weird about their behavior? He even talks about paying attention to people's hands.
Their hands.
Yeah. Like, are they holding anything? Are their hands visible? Or are they kind of hidden in their pockets like they might be concealing something?
Yeah.
And he says, pay attention to waistlines. See if you can spot the outline of a gun, like what they call printing under their clothes.
Wow. I never really thought about that.
Right. It's all about the details.
Yeah.
And he says, use all your senses, not just your eyes. Like he says, if you smell gunpowder, that could mean there was a shooting nearby.
Well, to smell of smoke if there's a fire starting somewhere.
Exactly. It's about being aware of all the information you're getting from your environment. And, one thing that stood out to me was him talking about motorcycles.
Motorcycles, what about them?
He says they can be a real problem. Like criminals use them to get around quickly. They can weave through traffic and disappear. It's something to be aware of, especially if you see one acting suspiciously.
I guess that makes sense, yeah. And he's speaking from experience.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
And this is key. He says you got to trust your gut. If you get that feeling that something's not right, don't ignore it. He uses the term check your six, which means to look behind you.
Oh, like a military term.
Exactly. And he says, don't worry about looking silly. Better to be safe than sorry.
Right. It's better to look over your shoulder than to get caught off guard. And one thing I found really interesting is that he really challenges our assumptions about who might be a threat. It's not always, the stereotypical bad guy.
Yeah, he says criminals can blend in. They can be well-dressed. They can look totally normal. And he specifically warns against underestimating women, young or old.
Women.
Yeah, he gives examples from Buenos Aires where they had teenage girl gang leaders and older women involved in robberies. It's a good reminder that danger doesn't always look how we expect it to.
That's true. So the goal of all this awareness is to, what? To just always be on edge?
No, not exactly. He talks about developing what he calls a red light in your head. It's like this intuitive sense that something's wrong, even if you can't quite put your finger on it.
I see. So it becomes almost automatic. You don't have to think about it. You just react.
Exactly. It's like your subconscious is constantly scanning for threats and giving you a warning.
Okay, so let's say you're developing this awareness, you're paying attention. What's the next step?
Well, if you own a gun for self-defense, Aguirre's advice is pretty straightforward. Carry it.
No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Nope. He says a gun locked up in a safe isn't going to do you any good when you need it. He's not a fan of waiting for some big, what do they call it online? SHTF day?
Yeah, stuff hits the fan day, like when society collapses completely.
Right. He says real threats, they happen out of the blue when you least expect it.
And he has some pretty strong words for those online discussions about, having a rifle and a group of buddies ready to go.
Oh, yeah. He's like, in the real world, you don't get an engraved invitation to an ambush.
Right. It's going to happen when you think everything's fine, when you're in regular clothes, maybe with your family. You're not going to have time to, gear up and call your friends.
Exactly. He uses the example of Aldo Rico, the mayor of San Miguel. This guy, he saw some armed guys near him, and he didn't hesitate. He acted immediately with what he had.
And he survived.
Right. And Aguirre also points out the importance of having enough firepower. Like, a revolver with its limited ammo capacity might not cut it if you're facing multiple attackers with, semi-automatic weapons.
Yeah, those things can hold a lot more bullets. So what about tactics? What does he say about actually using a gun in a self-defense situation?
Well, he starts with this really striking statement. A gun in your hand 10 seconds earlier beats the world's fastest draw. It all comes back to being proactive, trusting those gut feelings we talked about.
Right, so being aware and being ready. He gives some practical examples, right? Like if you're in a parking lot late at night and you see people walking towards you when everyone else is walking away.
Yeah, that's a huge red flag. Or if you get home and there's a car parked in front of your house that you don't recognize.
Or someone knocks on your door and you don't know who it is.
In that case, he says, get your gun ready before you even answer. Don't even think about opening the door without being prepared.
That's pretty intense. What about the legal stuff, though? Like, isn't showing your gun a crime?
He acknowledges that, yeah, brandishing is a serious offense. But he says, look, if the alternative is getting attacked or killed, it's the lesser of two evils. And his view on drawing your weapon when you feel threatened, especially in a total breakdown situation, is that it can actually deter criminals.
Because they're looking for easy targets, right?
Exactly. Someone who's clearly armed and ready to defend themselves is a lot less appealing than someone who looks helpless.
Okay, so let's say you do have to draw your weapon. What then?
Well, he talks about holster placement. His preference is the 4 o'clock position for a right-handed person, which is, roughly the small of your back.
Okay.
And he says to keep spare magazines at the 8 o'clock position. But he does say personal preference matters. You have to balance comfort with accessibility, how quickly you can get to your gun.
Right. It has to be practical. It's not about looking cool.
Exactly. And he makes this really important point that using a gun in self-defense is totally different from target shooting. He quotes this famous shooter, Rob Leatham, who says, accuracy is overloaded. Oh, yeah. In a real-life situation, it's chaotic, it's stressful. You're not going to have time to line up the perfect shot.
So what do? Just, spray and pray?
No, not exactly. He says the focus is on hitting the center mass of the attacker, like the chest area, and firing continuously until the threat stops. And he hates this idea of shooting to wound, which you see in movies all the time.
Yeah, that's not realistic.
No.
Yeah.
In a real fight, you shoot to stop the threat. Period.
And he makes another important point. Keep your eyes on the target. Always.
Absolutely. While you're drawing, while you're shooting, while you're reloading, even after the initial threat is down, you got to be scanning for other dangers. Don't get tunnel vision.
It's like you have to be aware of everything that's happening around you.
Exactly. And this is something people often forget. He says you need to be able to shoot with either hand.
Either hand? Why?
Well, he gives this example of a guy who got carjacked, and he had to use his non-dominant hand to defend himself. You never know what situation you'll be in.
Makes sense.
And he says, if you're carrying extra weight, like a beer belly, that can make drawing with your weak hand harder. You have to practice.
Practice makes perfect, or at least it gets you closer. So it's not just about shooting, it's about fighting.
Exactly. He brings up this thing called the Tueller drill. It basically shows how quickly someone can cover a short distance. Like, it's scary how fast someone can be on top of you.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so even if you have a gun, if someone's right up on you, they might be able to grab it. Guns aren't magic wands.
Right, so you need other skills, too.
He says hand-to-hand combat skills are vital. You got to be able to defend yourself if someone gets close to prevent them from using your own gun against you.
That's a scary thought.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
And his advice on when and how much to shoot is pretty blunt. Shoot first if you have to, and shoot as much as you need to stop the threat. This isn't a Hollywood standoff. He says aim for the center of the chest, then move up to the neck and face, what he calls zipping it up.
Jeez. That's pretty intense.
It is. It's serious business. And here's another thing. He even talks about using your gun as a blunt weapon, like if you run out of ammo, or if your gun jams.
Really?
Yeah, he says like a steel-framed gun, like a classic 1911, you can use it to strike. But with lighter polymer-framed guns, like Glocks, he suggests using the slide to hit vulnerable areas like the face.
So basically, use whatever you have to defend yourself.
Right. Be resourceful.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Aguirre spends a lot of time talking about the handgun as your primary defensive weapon. Why is that?
Well, he makes a distinction between, like, military guys or SWAT teams and regular people like us. They operate in totally different environments.
So what's different?
Well, rifles, while they're powerful, they're not easy to conceal. And like we talked about, attacks happen when you least expect them. So he says your focus should be on being armed in those everyday situations.
And that means a handgun.
Exactly. He even brings up Hurricane Katrina, where the authorities were disarming people carrying rifles openly, but they wouldn't have necessarily spotted a concealed handgun.
So even in a major disaster, concealed carry is more practical.
Right. And he really pushes for carrying a handgun with what he calls maximum fighting capability.
What does that mean?
He says prioritize things like how many rounds it holds, its accuracy, how well it fits your hand. Don't just choose a tiny gun because it's easy to hide.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
He compares it to carrying a handkerchief when you need a real tool to defend yourself. He's not a fan of those tiny little pocket pistols.
So what kind of gun does he recommend?
He's a big fan of semi-automatic handguns with high-capacity magazines. He says they're better for dealing with multiple attackers, which is a real possibility these days.
Yeah, you see that in the news all the time.
And he says, when you're choosing a handgun, think about size, weight, firepower, accuracy, and how fast you can reload it. He personally likes the Glock 31 in .357 SIG.
That's a pretty powerful caliber.
It is. And he really stresses having a high-capacity firearm, especially if society breaks down. He tells stories of people who successfully defended themselves with, pistols that could hold a lot of rounds.
Okay, so lots of emphasis on handguns. What about shotguns and rifles?
He does talk about them briefly. He says shotguns are good all around. They have tremendous stopping power up close.
Yeah, I've heard that.
But he also points out some problems for home defense, like they can be hard to maneuver in tight spaces, and you usually need two hands to operate them.
So you're kind of stuck if someone gets close.
Right. And he says cops who use shotguns often have a handgun as backup. They're also worried about bullets going through walls and hitting innocent people. And they usually work in teams. So it's a different situation for a civilian defending their home.
Makes sense. What about rifles?
He sees them as a real force multiplier, They have longer range, more power, they hold more ammo.
But they're not practical for everyday carry.
Right. But he does mention their intimidation factor. Like, if you have to show a rifle, it sends a pretty strong message.
I bet it does. What about calibers?
He talks about the debate between 5.56 millimeters and .30 caliber. He says .30 caliber rounds, like 7.62 by 39, 30.06, 7.62 by 5.1, those are favored by survivalists because they penetrate cover better. Like they can turn cover into concealment.
Meaning if someone's hiding behind something, a .30 caliber bullet might go right through it.
Exactly. And he talks a little bit about optics, scopes and sights for rifles, but his main focus is still on handguns.
Okay, so beyond firearms, what else does Aguirre emphasize for preparedness?
Well, he's a big advocate for body armor, but he's not saying you should wear it to the grocery store.
Right, that would be a little much.
He says to have it readily accessible for high-risk situations, like if you're transporting a lot of cash or meeting someone shady, or if there's an evacuation, there might be threats.
Or even, during riots or civil unrest.
Exactly. And he stresses practicing putting it on quickly, like a first responder would. He breaks down the different levels of body armor, explaining the difference between soft armor and hard plates.
So like level 2 and 3, a soft armor can stop most handgun rounds, but you need level 3 or 4 hard plates to protect against rifle fire.
Right. He says for most situations, good level 2 soft armor is a good balance, maybe with the option of adding hard plates. His point is, if you own guns for defense, body armor should be a priority.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Magazines. He says you need a lot of them, at least 6 per weapon, but ideally 12, especially for a rifle. And they need to be high quality.
Yeah, I've heard stories about cheap magazines jamming.
Exactly. He says number your magazines so you can track any that cause problems and test them regularly to make sure they feed reliably. Also, keep spare parts for common failures.
Good advice. What about cleaning?
He actually suggests some really practical, cheap alternatives to those expensive gun cleaning products, like motor oil, kerosene, red grease, simple cotton rags.
Really? That works.
He swears by it. He even gives a recipe for a homemade bore cleaner called Ed's Red, Uses stuff like transmission fluid, kerosene, mineral spirits, acetone.
Wow, okay. So you don't need fancy stuff to keep your guns clean.
Right. He does say to always check your owner's manual for specific cleaning instructions for your particular gun. But his point is to be self-sufficient.
Okay, now for the tough part. What happens after a gunfight?
Aguirre is very direct about this. His first steps are to be thankful you're alive, take care of any injuries, and call for help if possible. But he knows that in a crisis, help might not be coming.
Right, 911 might be overloaded.
Exactly. So his next piece of advice is to call your lawyer, specifically a criminal defense attorney.
And this is important. He says, don't talk to the cops beyond stating that you acted in self-defense and that you want your lawyer.
Absolutely. Anything you say can be used against you. Stay silent until you have legal representation.
Got it. What about specific scenarios? Like, what if you have to confront looters or robbers?
He says, don't negotiate. If you have to act, target the leader. That can often deter the others.
Okay. And what about afterwards? Like, what do you do with,
The body.
Yeah.
It's a tough situation. He says, try to find witnesses, at least 2 if possible, and take pictures of the scene, including the position of the body. He even talks about what to do if the cops don't arrive right away. Wrap the body and move it away from your home. Inform your witnesses what you did. But he acknowledges the legal risks of concealing a body.
Yeah, that's a really difficult situation.
It is. And when the cops do show up, he says to have your gun holstered or slung and show them your hands are empty. Don't give them any reason to misinterpret your actions.
Okay, that makes sense. What about self-defense while traveling?
He says your priority is always the safety of yourself and your family. If you have to defend yourself while traveling, he suggests taking pictures of the scene and getting contact info from any witnesses before leaving.
Get out of there as quickly as possible.
Exactly. You're not obligated to stay in a dangerous situation. Call the police once you're safe.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Any final thoughts from Aguirre?
He does touch briefly on finances and precious metals, especially in the context of societal breakdown. His main message is, cash is king.
Especially if the banks are closed or the power is out.
Right. He recommends keeping some cash on hand for emergencies, for essential expenses, and even holding a percentage of your savings in physical currency. He's a little wary of banks and safety deposit boxes in times of trouble.
Yeah, those might not be accessible. What about precious metals?
He sees gold as a long-term store of value. It holds its worth even when currencies collapse. He talks about bars, coins, and the importance of watching out for counterfeits.
And he likes pre-1965 U.S. silver coins as a kind of small change for transactions.
Right. And even scrap gold jewelry could be useful for bartering. His point is to have diverse forms of wealth, not just rely on the traditional financial system.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways from Aguirre's advice?
It boils down to a few things. Be aware of your surroundings. If you own a gun, carry it and be proficient with it. Understand basic tactics. And be prepared for the aftermath of a self-defense situation, both legally and logistically.
And remember, The Learner, we've focused on practical insights, not doom and gloom scenarios. We want to empower you, not scare you.
Exactly. And this leads to our final thought for you. What aspect of your personal preparedness needs the most attention right now? And what's one concrete step you can take to address it? Proactive thinking and preparation are the best tools we have in an uncertain world.
Think about it. Stay safe out there.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be getting into some really fascinating stuff for you guys, no matter what your background is or what your expertise is, because we're going to be getting into practical strategies for navigating economic hardship and the kind of shifts in society that you often see come along with that.
You know what's great about this deep dive is that we're going to be drawing on a very specific source. It's a book called The Modern Survival Manual by Fernando Ferfal Aguirre. And what's really cool about this book is it's not just kind of a bunch of abstract theory.
Right.
It's actually the experiences for Ferfal as he went through a really significant economic collapse. We're going to be talking about his story as it relates to yours.
Yeah, we're talking about Argentina.
That's right.
Yeah.
Argentina. 2001, it was a huge economic collapse. And what's so valuable, I think, about his story is he really tells you the nuts and bolts of how they adapted. I mean, it's everything from home-based businesses,
Right,
investments,
to personal finance,
to real estate,
bartering.
bartering,
Yeah.
like how all that stuff really works on the ground,
Yeah.
you know? We're also going to be looking at shifts in the government.
Right.
And maybe most importantly for you guys out there is community building. Like, how do you start building community during a time like this? I mean, really, the mission for you today is to pull out of this book and this conversation that we're having the most actionable insights that we can, and kind of surprise you along the way with how this stuff really works.
Well, let's jump into it. Let's start with something that actually I think a lot of people kind of gravitate towards when times get tough, and that is small-scale home businesses. These are things you can do literally out of your home. And it turns out that these can actually be remarkably resilient even during economic downturns.
Well, they're resilient because there's still a need.
Right.
And I think one of the insights that comes out of the book is that even when times are really tough and budgets are tight, people still look for small comforts. They still look for kind of personalized touches.
Sure.
So one of the things that he talks about is that even, in a depression, aromatic candles, soap, bath salts, these kinds of things, people still want them.
Yeah.
And he also talks about the fact that even during a depression, people still get married, they still have baptisms, they have communions,
right.
And all of that stuff requires certain kinds of items, gifts.
Right.
And a lot of people gravitate towards people who make these things at home.
Right.
He also talks about the fact that, of course, the most fundamental need that we have is food.
Sure.
And so catering became the big thing, small-scale catering. So again, all of these things are just sort of reminders that even during a depression, even during a real tough time, people still have basic needs, and even a little bit beyond basic needs. They're still looking for those little comforts and those personalized touches.
And I think it's interesting that, he really emphasizes what a lot of people would call an old-fashioned idea these days, and that is people skills.
Yes.
He even uses this image of the fat phone book,
Right.
back in the day. It's not really so much the phone book. It's your network, right?
That's right. And he really stresses over and over again the fact that these kinds of ventures, they thrive on personal connections, So it's your network, it's your friends, it's your family, it's the people you went to school with. It's the people you've met along the way in life.
Right.
And, maybe this is the time to pull out that dusty old Rolodex.
Oh, the Rolodex?
Remember the Rolodex?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember those.
Yeah.
And so the takeaway for you guys listening is this. Think about what you can offer. It might be a product, might be a skill. It might be something that you don't even think of right now as a marketable skill, but something that other people might really desire.
And the other thing that he really stresses, and you touched on this a little bit, is analyzing what's actually around you.
Right.
A lot of people make the mistake of saying, oh, I can make this thing. It's a great thing. I know people will love it. But are people actually looking for it in your local area?
Right.
Or are you trying to sort of force something into a market that doesn't really want it?
Right.
So I think that's a really important insight for people as they go through this.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, let's shift gears and talk about something a lot of people think about when they think about the future, and that's investments. We had a listener write in and say that a friend of theirs was thinking about opening a business that would install car sound systems, so stereos and speakers and all that, and also do window tinting and car alarms. What insights did the manual give us about this kind of venture during a period of economic downturn?
Well, this is a great opportunity for us to apply, and for you listening to apply this principle of what are the shifts in demand that might happen in a situation like this.
Right.
And what I think is so interesting is, your friend might be right in thinking that, well, people aren't going to spend money on, fancy sound systems if they're really worried about putting food on the table.
Right.
But the author, and again, I think this is one of the things that makes the book so refreshing. He's really blunt and honest about these things. And he says, even in a depression, people still want. You ready for this?
Hit me.
Booze, drugs, religion, prostitutes, gambling, and a loud car.
Wow. It's a pretty good list.
It's quite a list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are those really recession-proof, though? Or do they just kind of shift in how they're manifested?
Well, I think that's a really insightful point because, for example, he talks about this idea of, the car. Like, he grew up in Argentina seeing these old beat-up cars with incredibly expensive sound systems,
Right.
you know?
Right.
So I think, in your friend's case, the high end of the market may disappear,
Right.
but there are still people, even in tough times, who identify with their car and they want their car to be a certain way. So I think the insight for your friend and for anyone out there listening who's thinking about, businesses like this is to think about how those desires might actually manifest in an economic downturn, you know?
Right.
Maybe the top of the line stuff goes away, but there's still this persistent need or desire, I should say, for this idea of the loud car or the car that's been personalized.
Right. Right. And what about the other part, like the alarms and the window tinting? That almost seems like something that would demand would increase
Yes.
during a crisis like that.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think that we can expect that as economic hardship increases, we're going to see increases in petty crime. People are going to get desperate. They're
Yes,
going to
ma'am.
start breaking into cars. So things like alarms. And he also talks about security film,
Sure.
making it harder for people to break into your car. I think that's something that we can expect demand to go up. So your friend might be in a really good position there.
Okay. Now, he has a really interesting way of looking at what actually constitutes an investment. And it's not just, what you acquire or what you buy. It's really about what it actively does.
So that's right. And he makes this very sharp distinction between what a true investment is in his mind
Right.
and just storing value. You know?
Yeah.
So for him, a true investment is something that creates more money. So it's not just a matter of buying a bunch of tools
Right.
or stockpiling food.
Or gold or silver.
That's right. He even says that he doesn't consider gold to be an investment.
Right.
Gold is just a store of value.
Right.
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 Food,
Right.
you have to eat it. Tools.
They use them.
You use them, But a true investment is something that is going to produce more money. Now, your friend, in buying or opening up a business, and if you invest in that business, that could be considered a real investment.
Right.
Because you're buying into something that hopefully will produce more money for you.
Okay.
Now he puts it in the category of kind of an affordable luxury investment.
Okay.
And the reason he does that is because people are still going to be spending money on things that they want, even in a depression.
Okay.
And if the business is successful,
Right.
then your shares in that business will become more valuable, and it'll produce more money for you.
Okay. So that's like it's a medium to high risk investment
That's right.
in his category. So
Yeah.
okay, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about something a little more tangible,
Sure.
and that is real estate. Now, his family has a long history in real estate, and so he's got a lot of insights there that I think would be valuable for us. What's kind of his overall view of real estate as an investment during and after crisis?
Well, he really stresses for you and for anyone listening that real estate, if you can acquire it at a low market price,
Right.
is a lower risk but slower profit investment.
Right.
He even goes so far as to say that it's quote SHTF proof,
Right.
which is prepper slang for
For the worst case scenario.
some worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And the reason he says it's SHTF proof
Right.
is because you always have that piece of land.
Right.
You have the building. But he does say that location is super important. And when he says location, he doesn't just mean,
Right.
a general city or a general area.
Or even a neighborhood.
He talks about the importance of knowing
Go.
your block,
Yeah.
that one block can make all the difference,
Right.
And what he really stresses is that it's not just about how nice a place looks on the surface,
Right.
There's a lot more to it than that. You really have to get to know the underlying quality of a neighborhood.
So for folks out there who might be evaluating real estate or thinking about buying real estate when the prices go down, what are the things to look for that indicate that a neighborhood is going to hold its value?
That's a great question. And some of the things that he really highlights are the presence of long-established businesses, businesses that have survived previous crises. That's always a good sign. He also talks about the presence of professionals like, doctors, lawyers, dentists, that kind of thing.
Right.
And he specifically mentions the importance of seeing if the doctors and dentists and whatnot have younger successors lined up. Are they passing the business on to younger people? That's always a good sign that there's some continuity there. Good schools.
Right.
good schools that attract stable middle-class families.
Right.
He really stresses that over and over again. And I think that the real point that he's making is that these are all indicators of a community with deep roots. You know, it's not just some fly-by-night development.
Sure.
It's not just some new development. It's an area that's got some history to it.
Right. Right. And he actually contrasts those nice places, the older places, with kind of the newer developments.
Yeah. He observed during the crisis that the established nice places held their value.
Right.
Whereas just a block away in some of the newer developments, the price would go down significantly.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So, again, I think for the listener, it's just a reminder that the community fabric of a place really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And he also saw some really interesting niches emerge in the real estate market.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He talks about the increased demand for affordable, smaller places that are close to or in downtown areas.
Right.
And he tells this anecdote. It's fascinating about these two, I guess, middle-aged women who wanted to move from the suburbs into the city because there had been so many home invasions in the suburbs.
Right.
And so they felt safer being in the city in an apartment.
Yeah.
And he points out that, a lot of people had lost their jobs. They couldn't afford to live in the big house in the suburbs anymore, you know?
Right.
And they needed to be close to potential job opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So they would move into these smaller apartments in the city.
Yeah. But he doesn't say that all downtown areas become these good investments, right?
No, that's right. He cautions people that some downtown areas can become less desirable.
Right.
They can become, he uses the term rat holes, Right. And so it's really important that people, do their research.
Right.
Like actually go to these downtown areas.
At different times of day.
At different times of day,
Yeah.
And actually walk around and get a feel for the place.
Yeah. Okay. Now, for those of you out there who maybe own property or are thinking about buying property when the prices drop, he does have some really great advice about renting. And it sounds like he learned some of this stuff kind of the hard way.
Yeah, he tells the story about being way too lenient with a tenant.
Yeah.
Having to learn some hard lessons as a result of that.
So what's his main takeaway?
Well, the main takeaway is, and I'm quoting him here, it's business. Okay.
Right.
Don't get too friendly with tenants.
Right.
Know what your property is worth, and if the tenants can't afford to pay, then you need to tell them, hey, you need to go find something else,
Right.
So that's one of the real big takeaways. And the other one is, be really careful about contracts.
Right.
Yeah. He talks about a situation where he was renting a place and the real estate company tried to push on him this really unreasonable exclusive contract that would have prevented him from renting the place out to anybody else.
Right.
So he's really stressing that you really need to know the market and to negotiate and not just, take whatever is given to you.
Right. Right. He's also got a great tip for you guys about inflation in a rental contract.
Yeah, he talks about the fact that you really need to have some kind of a clause in there that allows you to renegotiate the rent.
Right.
After a certain period.
Right.
If inflation goes up considerably.
Right.
Or you have the option of breaking the lease.
Right.
Right. If you can't come to an agreement. So that's another really important takeaway.
Okay. Now, finally, when it comes to selecting tenants, he has some pretty specific advice.
Yeah, he basically says that you should look for clean, employed individuals without too many kids.
Okay.
And, this might sound a little harsh, but he says that you can tell a lot about a person by the way that they present themselves.
Sure.
And if somebody can't keep themselves neat, then they're probably not going to keep your property neat either.
Right.
He also says that you really have to check people's backgrounds,
Yeah.
Because he says it's so hard to get rid of bad tenants, and there are a lot of scams out there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's get into something that a lot of people, I think, imagine could make a comeback after a major crisis, and that is bartering. I've got this, you've got that, let's trade. What was the reality of bartering on the ground during the crisis in Argentina?
Yeah. So the initial phase after the collapse happened, there was a lot of uncertainty, and people weren't really sure what the value of the currency was. So traditional buying and selling kind of froze for a period.
Right.
And so there was this kind of this natural resurgence of bartering.
Sure.
And what we saw pop up all over Argentina were these things called barter clubs,
Right.
where people would come together
Yeah.
and try to exchange goods and services directly,
Right.
I've got eggs, you need eggs. I need someone to fix my plumbing. You're a plumber. Let's trade.
Okay. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
It seems like a natural first step,
Yeah.
When money's no good anymore,
Yeah.
you've still got to trade for stuff. So what went wrong with that?
Well, the problem that he points out, and this is really important for the listener, I think, is that it's hard to find what he calls a double coincidence of wants.
Right.
In other words, I've got to find somebody who wants what I have
Right.
and has what I want.
Right.
And he illustrates this beautifully with a story about his Aunt Margie.
Okay.
Now, Aunt Margie makes these beautiful sweaters,
Okay.
hand-knitted sweaters.
Right.
They're amazing.
Okay.
Nobody wants them,
Right.
And the things that she needs, like eggs
Right.
and other things, the people who have those things don't want sweaters.
They don't want sweaters.
Right.
They want something else.
Right. That's right.
And that's not just a theoretical problem, is it?
No, this was happening all over Argentina. I
Fair.
mean, even in rural areas where
Regret.
people were more accustomed to bartering,
Right.
This problem was persistent. He also tells this really funny story about his Uncle Bob. Now, Uncle Bob was a prepper before prepping was cool, and he had invested in a lot of .22 long rifle ammo,
Okay.
thinking, oh, this is going to be great for bartering,
Right.
Everybody's going to want ammo. Turns out that nobody wanted his ammo,
Right. Right.
And to make matters worse, the government came in and said, you can't sell that stuff privately anymore.
Oh, wow.
So his whole, prepper plan kind of went up in smoke.
So I guess, all those lists that people have of what's going to be worth its weight in gold,
Right.
after the collapse,
Yeah.
doesn't really work out that way in real life.
Yeah, I think the takeaway is, having some ammo, having some long shelf life food
Sure.
that can be useful for personal use. It can be useful for making limited exchanges with people you trust.
Right.
But this idea that you're going to become a post-collapse millionaire by stockpiling,
Right.
certain items, he really cautions against that.
You're right. Right. He even mentions the condom guy
Yeah,
who stocked up on tons and tons of condoms.
that's right.
And that wasn't really a great barter item.
No.
Okay. So if direct bartering didn't really work out for the most part,
Yeah.
what was the solution that people came up with these barter clubs?
Well, the barter clubs tried to solve this problem of the double coincidence of wants by introducing a system of credits,
Okay.
local credits. So essentially, they would create a local paper currency,
Right.
specific to their barter club.
Right.
Or specific to their town or their city.
Right.
And so they'd say, okay, well, you've got a dozen eggs, that's worth, 5 credits.
Gotcha.
And you've done an hour of plumbing, that's worth 10 credits,
Oh.
So they were trying to introduce this kind of paper money system.
To make it more fluid.
To make it more fluid, yeah. So that people could trade their goods and services for these credits and then use the credits to buy other stuff. But there were some pretty serious problems with this.
Okay. What were they?
The first problem was that it was really hard to determine the fair value of things,
Yeah.
Like, is an hour of plumbing really worth a dozen eggs, or is it worth, a handmade piece of furniture?
Right.
It was very subjective.
Right.
But the second problem, and I think this is even more significant,
Yeah.
was that these credits were incredibly easy to counterfeit.
Right.
It's not like official government currency, which has all kinds of,
Sure.
security features, watermarks, holograms.
Right.
This stuff was just printed on a simple printer.
Right. Right.
And so it was really easy to fake it.
So that's not sustainable.
Not really sustainable, no.
Okay. Yeah.
And so what ended up happening is that most of these barter clubs just went back to using the official paper currency,
Right.
even though it was, going up and down in value.
Sure.
And what's really interesting is that over time, many of these barter clubs evolved into what he calls these gray or black markets,
Right.
where, they were using regular money,
Right.
but they were selling stolen goods.
Oh.
They were, not paying taxes. So it became a whole other thing.
Interesting. Interesting. So the takeaway there is that, bartering, it's not a panacea,
No,
you know.
not at all.
You're probably going to need some form of
Right.
agreed upon currency.
Right.
Even if it's not official. And the other takeaway is that sometimes the people who benefit the most
Yeah.
from a new system
Yeah.
aren't necessarily the participants.
Yeah. He makes the point that the real winners in all of this barter club phenomena
Right.
were the people who owned the spaces where these barter clubs
Right.
took place.
Oh, interesting.
Because they could rent out space
Sure.
to the participants.
Yeah.
So just an interesting thing for the listener to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, let's talk about something that probably became very useful in this evolving gray market and black market, and also just in everyday life. And that is bargaining and haggling.
Yeah. Haggling became a real art form in Argentina
Right.
after the collapse.
Okay.
And he really gets into this, and he gives a lot of practical advice on how to haggle effectively.
Okay. Well, let's have it. What are some of his main takeaways there? What are some of his main suggestions?
Well, I think probably the most important one is to always be ready to walk away.
Right.
If you're too eager, if you're too anxious to buy something, the price is going to stay high.
Right.
So you really got to be able to walk away, and that means not being emotionally attached to the item.
Right.
He also talks about this idea of playing poor.
Okay.
So even if you're not poor, you want to convey this sense that,
You're on a budget.
hey, I'm on a budget here.
Right.
I can't really afford to pay that much.
Right.
He also says don't be afraid to offer a lot less
Right.
than the asking price. Like start at half or even 20%.
Yeah.
Particularly for things that are way overpriced.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so those are all classic negotiating tactics. What else does he say?
Well, he says if you're buying multiple items,
Right.
ask for a quantity discount.
Yeah.
If there are any defects or imperfections, point them out
Right.
and ask for a discount,
Right.
and don't hesitate to mention the prices that you've seen elsewhere,
Yeah.
Hey, I saw the same item down the street for X amount,
Right. Right.
He also talks about asking for a cash discount.
Right.
Because a lot of times these people are trying to avoid taxes,
Right.
So if you can pay in cash, they're more likely to give you a